Human in the battle of art and literature versus the ordinary commodities as reflected in Janet Winterson's The Gap of Time and Ian McEwan's Nutshell.
Thank you.
Buyurun hocam.
Thank you. Can you? Okay. I hope you get my voice. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Well, to be talking about art and literature as some of the oldest artifacts through which the humans envisage a chance of enlarging or enriching their perception of the actual existence. As we know from starting with antiquity and especially in Renaissance drama and art, there is a deep reflection on the nature of human being. Especially in Elizabethan drama, thinking about Renaissance hero, how he fails to realize his full human potential, either because of the kind of the world he lives in or the kind of self he makes through his own actions. One should think about the exploration of human conscience, human potential in the light of the humanistic view of man that brings about the rise of some mostly tragic characters who acknowledge the great disappointment in a human being. Among Shakespeare's tragic heroes, this disillusionment is mostly explicitly expressed in his important play Hamlet, as he states in one of his soliloquies, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." The exploration of human potential together with the human conscience led to the awareness that the man could rise to the cosmic hierarchy of the great chain of being, to the perfection of divinity, but as a result of overreaching, excessive ambition, jealousy, or desire for power, man can easily degenerate to bestiality. Since literature fulfills our need to imagine and reflect upon human nature, it also contributes to what Giorgio Agamben calls anthropogenesis, a concept which in his work, The Sacrament of Language, is explained as the becoming human of man. For Agamben, anthropogenesis emerges when the man who finds himself speaking must confront the problem of efficacy and truthfulness of his word, that is, of what can guarantee the original connection between names and things and between the subject who has become a speaker and thus capable of asserting and promising and his actions. Going beyond the cognitive aspect of language that limits the human knowledge in the inadequate relation between signify and signified, Agamben stresses out that anthropogenesis was restricted by scientists to a cognitive order, quote, as if the becoming human of man were solely a question of intelligence and brain science, and not also one of ethos, as if intelligence and language did not also, and above all, pose problems of an ethical and political order, as if Homo sapiens was not also, and of course precisely for that reason, a Homo justus. So the concept of justice is so imprinted in Agamben's viewing of language and man becoming human of a man through language. Language frequently was viewed as a sign of human exceptionalism for the reason of conveying the ideas between social beings. Now is viewed as something important, special, but also something perilous, a main obstacle to communication. The man does not simply acquire language among other multiple aptitudes he possesses, but puts his very nature at stake in language, as Agamben says. Agamben considers that human being does not speak through a language, but in a language, dismantling the possibility of human reigning sovereign over language as a commodity. He challenges the human with the ethical task to testify by oath to language in a manner as if consciousness grasped language and not the opposite. In The Sacrament, Agamben claims that the oath is understood as the anthropogenetic operator by means of which the living being who has discovered itself speaking has decided to be responsible for his word and devoting himself to the logos to constitute himself as the living being who has language. The human being should appropriate the anonymous voice of the event of language and act, which is also anthropogenetic and become the responsible precursor and upholder of its performative significance. Man who puts himself at stake in language can devote himself to logos and through the oath can express the demand to bind together in an ethical and political connection words, things, and action. In the tradition of Western philosophy, human is viewed as at the disjunction between the contemplative life and active life, whereas Agamben opens it to the potentiality to act and not to act, a choice which becomes inoperative in all its operations, as Agamben says. In Fire and Tale, another work of Agamben, he explains that contemplation and inoperativity are the metaphysical operators of anthropogenesis, which, freeing the living human being from any biological or social destiny and from any predetermined task, make him available for that particular absence of work we are used to calling politics and art. To Agamben, politics and art are not regarded as tasks or works, rather they represent a space where the linguistic and bodily operations, such as material and immaterial, social and biological, become dissolved and contemplated in their very essence. This poetics of inoperativity, to use Agamben's term, may be the metaphor for Shakespeare's Hamlet par excellence, an epitome of human being who contemplates his own potentiality to act or not to act, and becomes eventually all his operations. It may also be considered the conceit of Ian McEwan's Hamlet-inspired protagonist in the novel Nutshell, published in 2016. An 8-month-old fetus who is entrapped to listen from his mother's womb to the spoken criminal plot of his mother Trudy and his uncle Claude against his father John Cairncross. The circumstances of the novel's composition are not certain, and though there are explicit allusions to Shakespeare's Hamlet, and when interviewed, Ian McEwan denies any attempt at rewriting the Shakespearean play, claiming that I didn't really intend to write a version of Hamlet, it just sort of crept in. Curiously, the novelist's intention to write his novel overlaps with the decision of Penguin Random House in October 2015 to launch the Hogarth's Shakespeare series, which resulted in the publisher's commissioning of all-star roster of contemporary authors to rewrite Shakespeare's plays on their choice as a novel. Hogarth Shakespeare launches a challenge for explicitly intertextual contemporary works, but it also manages to raise the awareness to the tensions of the contemporary cultural productions because of the unique situations of the literary novel as a genre that has, since the early 20th century, occupied an uneasy borderland between the realm of art and commerce. Many prominent writers find an opportunity, if commissioned by the mega publisher, to participate into an intertextual dialogue between writers, a dialogue which would increase the prestige of their work. This new production would reach a larger scale audience and as a result would provide an extraordinary opportunity to reach the global marketplace for the novels. The problem is that while Hogarth Shakespeare series offers a unique opportunity for the writers on the global publishing scale, the novelists face the conflict which is relevant to the contemporary fiction. a desire to preserve the distinctive aura of the literary, battling with an inescapable recognition that the literary field is neither autonomous nor clearly distinguishable from the broader marketplace of cultural goods. Keeping this in mind, it is not certain whether Ian McEwan is commissioned for the project and refuses the author, or simply tried on the individual level to rise to the challenge of the Hogarth Shakespeare series without losing his artistic autonomy and still gain prestige, since in 2016, the first edition of Nutshell is published by Jonathan Cape Publishing House, and later in the same year by Random House. As mentioned earlier, the novelist denies any intention to rewrite Shakespeare, and it might be true, but the intertextual connections he sets with Shakespearean text cannot be ignored, especially when the novel's first page delivers a famous quote from Hamlet. "Oh God, I could be bound in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." Moreover, the characters Trudy and Claude, who explicitly plot the crime against John, are other indices to Shakespearean text. However, it should not be ignored that the intertextual connections to other important literary texts and traditions, like Renaissance poetic tradition, metaphysical tradition, poetic tradition, Renaissance poetic tradition, modernist poetic tradition, are always in an intertextual dialogue, and especially there is a perpetual engagement into some philosophical discussions with Theodor Adorno's essay on art, Deleuze's essay on what is philosophy, again considering the act of creation, Agamben, again the concept of anthropogenesis, and again his consideration of the work of art. It can be said that Ian McEwan uses Shakespeare's Hamlet as a frame in his novel, but he engages into a battle concerning the meaning of a true work of art, the significance of creation, and especially the use of language as an oath by an artist, as an act of anthropogenesis. McEwan allows the space of his fiction to deliberate upon the relationship between the author and his creation that might be in conflict with each other. McEwan presents an unusual narrative, which, according to Mueller, is an innovative achievement of a novelist, as it delivers the creation of the imaginary world of the fetus in the interaction with the body of his mother, a world that is inaccessible in real life, only presentable by an effort of imagination. Though we don't have the intention of arguing with this opinion, we should remember Luigi Pirandello's preface to 6 Characters in Search of an Author, who views the mystery of artistic creation in terms of mystery of natural birth, while the artistic creation as an embryo in search for a fruitful womb, a space of fantasy that could nurture it so that it may live eternally. McEwan delivers the act of creation as an allegory of parthenogenesis, which is in a constant dialogue with Agamben's anthropogenesis, a metaphor of creative power displayed through his unborn fetus, who is in the process of becoming human and contemplates the potentiality of freeing himself from any biological or social destiny in order to make himself available for art. Of course, this discussion could be developed to certain lengths, but unfortunately the space of this conference does not allow us to do this right now. Hopefully for the interested ones, there would be a published version of this presentation where all the details will be provided. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Golban, for your fascinating presentation. Now, our next presenter is again Professor Golban, who is the chair of our English Language and Literature Department at Tekirdağ Namık Kemal University. Professor Golban, the floor is yours. Petro Hocam?
Now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Since you're all are my colleagues, you might have expected me to talk about the Bildungsroman, but I will focus on Romanticism, although I might have done that in relation to the novel of formation, since Romanticism played a very important role in the foundation and the historical advancement of this type of fiction. To say nothing but to mention Goethe, who founded the genre with his canonical Wilhelm Meister Lekrjahre at the end of the 18th century, and he was a pre-romantic writer at that time, a member of Sturm und Drang movement. That is before he betrayed, let's say, in Romanticism and became a classicist. And the first probably novel of formation in English literature, Sartor et Sartus, was written by Carlyle, encompassing in his work both Goethe and Byron, that is, continuing a romantic tradition into the early Victorian age. So I will focus on Romanticism, although you may say that Romanticism seems very much in the past and old and perhaps obsolete, but Romanticism is continuously critically and metacritically revived. Romanticism is a kind of opera aperta, I would say, to paraphrase Umberto Eco's words, open to interpretation, open to discussion. Next to me is a book, a very famous book by Greg Gerald, Eco-Criticism, and on its page 44 begins a chapter on Wordsworth. It points to the interaction of Romanticism with the Industrial Revolution, which brought about a decisive shift in the relations of the country and city of the imagination. That's a quotation from the book. And when we say country, we mean nature as well, because in Romanticism, these two elements are indispensable. You may remember famous line from Tinternebbe by Wordsworth: these pastoral farms, green to the very door, this symbiotical unity between countryside and nature. Indeed, Romanticism opens new thematic perspectives on the relationship between the human being and nature, giving rise, Gerard says, to the sympathetic interrelation of the creative human mind and the creative nature. But this relationship or interrelation is not a mutual interaction yet, because the effects go from nature to the human being and not from the human being towards nature yet, I say. Therefore, if we agree to Pippa Marland's definition of eco-criticism, that is, eco-criticism is an umbrella term for a range of critical approaches that expose the representation in literature and other cultural forms of the relationship between the human and the non-human, largely from the perspective of anxieties around humans' destructive impact on the biosphere. So this last part of this definition, the anxieties around the human's destructive impact on the environment. So it's not yet applicable to the romantic attitude. It will be later, perhaps in Victorian age, where we have the consequences of industrialization to be reflected in literature, especially realist fiction, in the novels of Dickens and others. In Romanticism, during the Romantic period, the human being is now rendered as the individual, and the literary theory produces the expressive theory of authorship, gives birth to the author, to the authority of the author, although later in the postmodern period destroyed by Roland Barthes in his Death of the Author. Along the thematization of the individual experience, Romanticism textualizes nature, and in multiple and various ways. To remember again this poem Tinternaby by Wordsworth, nature is the source of feelings in youth, the source of elevated thoughts in maturity. Nature is the sustainer of the poet's moral being. Nature is ranked to divinity. The poet claims, I so long a worship of nature. But the most important aspect is that nature is co-author in the act of poetic creation. So, unlike the previous periods in 18th century, neoclassical poetry, earlier periods, poetry is no longer loco-descriptive, but not just taking nature as a beautiful place, a mirror of human existence, etc., but nature is used for more important purposes, among which, as I said, this promotion of individualism. We have this concept of the rise of individualism in Romanticism, but we have to remember that individualism in Romanticism is not yet individual identity. In English Romantic poetry, nature is a major literary concern, which in its textualization is thematically heterogeneous, as well as different from earlier literary traditions. The typology of nature, as conceived by the Romantic writers, calls attention to ecological issues and this human destructive effect on the environment in a lesser degree than it deifies or just praises the variety of natural elements and phenomena, representing diverse manifestations and effects on human existence. Nature is, in Romanticism, is a theoretical and critical concern, among others, such as language of poetry, theory of imagination, subject matter of poetry. To remember Schiller, one of the founders of Romantic critical theory, who in his On Naive and Sentimental Poetry, by the way, acclaimed as a prototype of ecocritical theory, claims that poets will either be nature or they will seek lost nature. And another famous statement I have here from this essay, that our feeling for nature is like the feeling of an invalid for health, which implies that having such an alienated or reflective relation to nature is an ambiguous predicament, because by it we gain in freedom and perspective what we lose in spontaneous immediacy and feeling. Still, nature in Romanticism does not receive a level of equality to that of the individual, because with regard to Romantic rise of individualism, Fichte promotes subjective idealism. This concept implies that the subject is absolute, logical prior to the world, or non-subject, including nature, and is the active agent in asserting a material world which is opposed and below it. To give a few examples, would be William Wordsworth, again, Tintern Abbey, a poem whose representation of natural world transforms the tradition of the loco-descriptive and topographical genres, and is also quite different from the modern ecological perspectives on physical nature. In this poem, nature is not presented as something like a matter of elegy or personified, or presented as a token of the social values of order and prosperity, like in neoclassicism. But the presentation of nature is structured according to the inward motions and transition of the observing consciousness. When we say motions and transitions, as rendered in this poem, it reveals a poetic mind in development, a kind of process of formation, as in the Bildungsroman. So this transition from youth to maturity, which Wordsworth renders based on John Locke's philosophy of the three stages of the development of the human mind. So individual experience, which is a major concern in Romantic literature, rendering the rise of individualism, shows nature and countryside to be indispensable for the expression of personal emotions and feelings, as the source of personal emotions and feelings. As in Tintern Abbey, Coleridge adds to this the supernatural and the concern and expression of psychology, as in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, his famous poem. So, but in general, in Romantic literature, in its essential manifestation, nature depicts and expounds what is called the construction of the dualism of existence in Romantic writing, particularly with regard to the romantic self-indulging experience of escapism, which represents a very important and defining aspect of the Romantic rise of individualism. Numerous examples may include Ode to the West Wind and To a Skylark by Shelley, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Byron, The Eve of St. Agnes by Keats, and other literary works. This romantic dualism of existence is nothing but a sample of modern binary opposition. The first and foremost is the dualism of mind and body, or spirit and corporeality, or psychology, physiology, as in Coleridge, or soul and body, good and evil, freedom and system, as in Schelling. In general, we have dichotomies such as culture, nature, subject, object, history, individual, reality, dream, reality, illusion. These are very different forms of reality versus non-reality. So romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, they create dream worlds following the general and deliberate romantic trend to project an imaginative world which is clearly distinct from the actual world. And especially Coleridge and other romantics, conceiving both elements in dualism as inseparable, lament and wish to overcome the Cartesian division between them, since separation would deprive them of all meaning, root, living essence, and objective truth. Coleridge, actually, I remember, coins the term psychosomatic when declares the body to be the fixture of the mind. And this is in his essay on the passions, in which he works towards a physiological psychology that gives supremacy to mind and makes the body its expression. Blake does it in a rather Neoplatonist way, again asserting the spiritual world over the physical, what I called corporeality, carnal reality. Now this is thematized in establishing a relationship between individual and the world, human condition. This is a kind of relationship of non-relationship, I would say, since the individual is misfit, solitary, and superior to this world. And this prompts the two thematic perspectives of famous romantic rebelliousness, as in Shelley or Byron, but more often we find this perspective of romantic escapism from reality into a non-reality. This inferior material real world and superior non-reality, that's what I was talking about, the two worlds of existence representing this modern expression of the binary opposition in romantic poetry in the form of romantic dualism of existence. It is important to remember that this refuge is ever desired. The access to the congenial world of existence is sometimes granted to the romantic persona, but this is a ecstatic, epiphanic moment of experience, but fleeting, never fully achieved, because the romantic persona is bound to the to his human condition, to this corporeality. If you know "Oh to the West Wind" by Shelley, oh, lift me as a wave will lift a cloud, this desire of escapism, this desire to enter this romantic cycle of immortality, of death and rebirth, and immediately comes the next line is, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. So this blood, thorns of life, this reality of the flesh does not allow the individual to achieve it. Or Byron, Childe Harold, imagining this superior form of existence in this framework of the dualism of existence. Lift me, sorry, he says, like children, he would watch the stars till he had peopled them with beings bright. If he would have kept his spirit to this flight, he would have been happy, but this clay, this carnal reality, this human condition will sink its spark immortal. You see, this is impossible. However, in a second, I want you to remember again Byron in Manfred. In Manfred, making his Manfred a kind of accomplished Faust. From the very beginning, he is fulfilled. The escapism is achieved. The question is, does it bring happiness? No, because the desire for forgetfulness, for oblivion, for being forgiven does not grant it. So this anti-romanticism of Byron, you see, challenges some of these fixed perspectives, thematic perspectives of the romantic literature. Because we don't have time, I would draw the conclusion saying that the literature of the Romantic period, illuminating, apart from illuminating a number of various romantic thematic perspectives, so in this literature of the Romantic period, nature is a major concern in itself, another thematic perspective in being illuminated and maintained by other thematic concerns. Nature is in itself a source of escapism, represents that world in dualism, which is an alternative to the abstracting realities of the actual world. Nature is a major source of feelings, of knowledge, is related to pantheism, a kind of naturalistic pantheism, and especially is the prompter, supporter of the romantic rise of individualism and the assertion of the author, the authority of the author. Despite Roland Barthes' proclamation of the death of the author is still revived to the present. My colleague talking about McEwan made me remember now his novel Atonement, which proclaims the authority of the author. So, and by this, at least, Romanticism is present among us, and it will probably continue so. So it is an opera aperta for critics, for readers, and for us, those that focus on literary phenomena. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Golban, for your presentation. I'm sure it will be an invaluable contribution to those who are interested in Romanticism and Romantic poetry. Our next presenter is another colleague of ours, Derya Benli, who is currently writing her PhD dissertation at Istanbul University and working at the same time at Tekirdağ Namık Kemal University. And her paper is titled Transcending the Limits, Empowerment of Hybrid Identity in the Buddha of Suburbia. Floor is yours.
Sesi açabildim mi?
Hı hı.
Tamam. Ekran paylaşımı yapıyorum ama ilk defa yapacağım. Oldu mu?
Görünüyor.
Bilmiyorum. Tamam. Şuradan.
Kapak görünüyor şu anda.
Hı hı. Tamam. Hello everyone. I'm the Transcending the Limits, the Empowerment of Hybrid Identity in the Buddha of Suburbia. With the acceleration of mass migration and globalization, the old-fashioned categorizations have been replaced by more flexible and seamless norms and ideas that celebrate cultural complexity, hybridity, and mobility. Hanif Qureishi's first novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, handles the issues of identity, race, class, London as a metropolitan city, and suburban life with humorous, critical, and subversive manner. By presenting its protagonist Karim's growing up into an actor and bringing the concepts of becoming and multiculturalism together, the novel also outwardly conforms to the principles of postmodern Bildungsroman. I argue in this work that the term interstitial is the essential idea that defines the novel itself and every other notion that the novel attempts to express, such as identity, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, city, suburbia. These have indefinite and floating meanings and cannot be fixed into a single category because of their liquid connotations. The protagonist Karim's process of becoming starts in the suburbs of London and proceeds into the city. As a multicultural and postmodern Bildungsroman, Qureishi's novel encompasses Karim's experience of being a second-generation immigrant in London suburbs and how he constructs his own interstitial space and fluid identity among racial, sexual, and social categories. He introduces himself. My name is Karim Amir, and I'm an Englishman, born and bred, almost. I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed as it were, having emerged from two old histories. But I don't care. Englishman I am, though not proud of it. From the South London suburbs and going somewhere. Here, Karim's first-person narration and self-description reveals his racially hybrid character and his suburban origin. Until postmodernity, the These city and the suburb has often been represented as two opposite terms and has having sharp boundaries. However, the writers who celebrate multiplicity, the postmodern writers, and heterogeneity have attempted to eliminate these distinctive borders and show that the suburb too can provide myriad of experiences and possibilities, cultural, ethnic, and sexual richness. In the Buddha, Croatia overtly portrays the eccentric aspect of Karim's suburbia, although Karim doesn't seem to be aware of it. In the first part of the novel, entitled In the Suburbs, Karim is involved in various suburban experiences as he is in a state of constant movement, while presenting both conventional and unconventional aspects of suburbia. The night Karim and his father Harun are invited to Eva K's house is the turning point in their life, which takes them out of the dullness of suburban society while introducing new possibilities. Here, Karim's father teaches some spiritual practices to suburban people by using his authentic and Indian identity. And by doing that, and with his mysticism and teachings of Buddhism, gradually evolve into a product which they commodify for the white society. These gatherings in various suburban houses become the zones of consumption or the microcosm of a shopping center. It is evident that Harun builds a social identity by marginalizing and exoticizing himself on purpose and takes advantage of his ethnic background to subvert the consumerist and materialist suburban mentality. Croatia's postmodern Bildungsroman offers a mixture of multiple contexts that contribute and provide for the character development of the protagonist, such as the suburban environment, metropolitan London, queer relationships, and various forms of hybrid representations. Like many postmodern theorists and writers, Croatia draws the straight line between hybridity and identity by presenting different aspects of hybridity, including racial, cultural, and sexual. The theorists like Homi Bhabha, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Deleuze defines hybridity in different ways. And the most important one is Homi Bhabha's third space, the concept of third space, as he is defining here, you can read. In the novel, Croatia intends to create a character who has always desired to belong that third space, with his ethnicity, liberal mentality, cultural and social status, and sexual preference. Karim is both literally and metaphorically a nomad, who is in constant mobility and capable of adapting to different spaces. He goes out of the boundaries of the suburban home and family, which is fixed and steady, and this can be categorized as an arborescent entity in Deleuzean terms, and Karim is overtly within a rhizomatic experience and progression that end up with character transformation. In this sense, Karim shatters the boundaries of center and periphery, self and other, black and white, and same and different, by moving across them freely and recklessly as a migrant body, while at the same time perpetuating his formative journey, having no eventual destination. The move from rural to urban or province to town is a crucial part of the individual development of the protagonist, since this special transition brings about different social environments, new experiences, and new horizons. As a nomad embodied by youthful dynamism, mobility, and passion, Karim's journey towards his Bildung continues in London, which is a new phase for his personal and professional life, and which also constitutes the second part of the novel entitled In the City.
Hocam slaytlar ilerlemiyor bizde. Onu tam ekran yaparsanız belki ilerler.
Tam ekran aslında hala bende.
Ama biz hala kapağı görüyoruz.
Aa,
Hı hı.
neyse bu şekilde devam edeyim çünkü.
Tamam, tamam.
Tamam. Karim's move from the suburbs to London is a kind of cross-cultural migration parallel to the migrant experience of his preceding generation coming from India. Just as they struggled with cultural dislocation and marginalization, Karim too undergoes cultural and racial deterritorialization because of both his suburban and half South Asian origin. In the Victorian Bildungsroman specifically, the hero is required to gain a more developed perspective of both his inner self and his physical environment and relationships, which signals his or her spiritual, emotional, moral, and social maturation. Karim has a number of epiphanies as he grows up, and his epiphanies exactly demonstrates his mature sense of self by recognizing his own transformation. As Karim grows up and is involved in various social and cultural environments out of the suburbs, his perspective of life is shaped by these external influences, which make him look at things from a different angle. Through the end of the novel, Karim is presented as more inquisitive about himself and his environment, and is able to grasp the difference between his childhood and his newly acquired, matured, and empowered self. Concerning his father's and Karim's subversive performative acts in the Buddha's specific emphasis on acting, it can be argued that Croatia adheres to Bakhtin's concept of carnivalesque. Bakhtin's idea of carnival proposes a zone of complexity where all social ranks, hierarchies, categories, and restrictions are suspended and equalized, contrary to the official feast of the Middle Ages, held by a hierarchical and political order. Carnival is a place for feasting and laughter, embraces freedom of expression, and nourished by dynamism and change. Here, Bakhtin suggests the peculiar logic of the inside out and of the turnabout, of a continual shifting from top to bottom, from front to rear, of numerous parodies and travesties, humiliations, profanations, comic crownings, and uncrownings. A second life, a second world of folk culture is thus constructed. It is to a certain extent a parody of the extra carnival life. A world is inside out. On stage, Karim steps in a carnivalesque world in which he is always in pursuit of laughter, plays with shifting identities, manipulates the existing social and racial normativities and strict divisions, and turns the colonial gaze upside down by ridiculing and undermining his own ethnicity as an Indian. Just as he has acquired an awareness of his Indian identity, Karim develops a special insight towards his Britishness too, when he goes to America with his company for the play. This time, as British, he witnesses an attempt of cultural and racial categorization and prejudice when he hears an American saying that these English are animals, their whole culture has fallen through the floor. Here, Karim ultimately acknowledges that the problem is not being British or Indian, and that racial homogenization is everywhere. What is significant is getting rid of the essentialist concepts and constructing universal and fluid identities. In New York, Karim meets Charlie and stays there for 6 months, and then returns to London. A new phase is often opened in his professional career as he is offered a significant role in a well-known soap opera in London. The novel ends with a celebration dinner for Karim's new and prestigious job and his final remark regarding his current and future position in life. This ambiguity, indeed, is what Croatia attempts to articulate throughout the novel. In this world, nothing serves for a singular and indefinite correspondence. In the Buddha, he portrays the amalgamation of the concepts that have been previously categorized and polarized, such as suburb and city, black and white, British, non-British, male, female, comic, and tragic. By annihilating and destabilizing the boundaries between clear-cut and definitive concepts such as nationality, ethnic identity, gender norms, and social hierarchies, Croatia establishes a seamless and liminal space where his protagonist is able to crisscross multiple identities and construct alternative spaces to perpetuate his character formation. By discovering the essence of himself, Karim is now more determined for the future, which he would live more deeply. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Derya Hocam, for your presentation. Our next presenter is a former student, now colleague of ours, just started his PhD. Gaslighting in George Orwell's fiction, psychologizing the thematic perspectives by Sinan Altaş.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Sesimi duyabiliyor musunuz?
Evet hocam.
Öncelikle sizlerle bu oturumda bulunmak benim için büyük bir mutluluk. Onu paylaşmak isterim. Gerçekten de onur duyuyorum sizle burada olmaktan.
Bizim için de öyle.
Çok teşekkür ederim hocam. Just a second. The topic of my study is gaslighting in George Orwell's fiction and the ways in which he psychologized the thematic perspectives he adopted in The Animal Farm and in 1984. I'll try to run through my presentation as quickly as possible. I know we are already late. Well, I would like to start with the description of the clinical psychological term. Gaslighting is a systemic way of manipulation which aims at distorting a mentally healthy individual's perception of reality and memories. It is an interpersonal manipulative communication pattern. As a consequence of this mentally destructive interference, the gaslighted individual is rendered psychologically dependent on the abuser. This pattern manifests itself in continuous manipulative statements that prompt an individual to doubt their version of reality. The bottom line is there must be a pattern and it cannot be a one-time thing to be called gaslighting. American Psychological Association defines and explains gaslight as follows: to manipulate another person into doubting his or her perceptions, experiences, or understanding of events. And well, on a side note, gaslighting can be either conscious or unconscious. What I mean is, regardless of people who employ it as a tool of manipulation, it doesn't have to be a conscious attempt necessarily. Gaslighter might simply have one of the personality traits that known as dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And as I said, it doesn't have to be conscious necessarily. Origin of gaslighting: literature has always tended to develop strong intertextual relationship with both precedent and antecedent literary works, as well as contemporary ones in its historical progress. Literature is also given impetus by another driven force, which is known as interdisciplinarity, where literature and other scientific domains perpetually exchange their intellectual creations and properties. Well, owing to aforementioned interdisciplinary nature, the term gaslighting is not quite surprisingly borrowed from literature. It is based on Gaslight by British novelist and playwright Patrick Hamilton. And in 1944, thanks to the movie adaptation Gaslight, the term became thoroughly popular for the first time. Nowadays, within and beyond the borders of psychology, gaslighting has become an ubiquitous term encompassing mind manipulating strategies employed by abusive people. In the aftermath of 2016 presidential election in the USA, due to all the twisted facts and fake news which were put forward by the politicians, the term gaslighting has once again become popular. For instance, Donald Trump and many other politicians have been perpetually abusing their voters, gaslighting them by twisting historical facts purposefully, methodologically, denying their previous statements, and perhaps most importantly, by distrusting reliable sources of information in order to render people dependent on themselves again. And diagnosing gaslighting, well, a reliable psychometric test that can diagnose gaslighting is yet to be developed. Now that we have the issue with gaslighting's introduction out of the way, I would like to proceed with Orwell's fiction. "1984 and Animal Farm." I will be able to give you some extracts from only 1984. In this study, psychologization of two principal novels by George Orwell, Animal Farm and 1984, are analyzed within the framework of gaslighting. Some extracts from 1984 will be briefly explained according to the three main stages of gaslighting, as Dr. Robin Stern suggested in the Gaslight Effect. First stage is disbelief. Second one, defense. And third one is depression. Well, as a matter of fact, these stages are originally suggested for personal gaslighting cases. Nevertheless, I have tried to adapt it for my analysis due to the lack of theoretical basis concerning this term. Hitler burned books, Stalin had them rewritten, George Orwell says. Orwell is attempting to underline the unreliability of politics and the ways in which historical accounts can be distorted and manipulated, as it had happened in the Soviet Union, where leaders of the revolution, such as Trotsky and Bukharin, were simply erased from the photographs, and consequently, collective memory of a nation was defiled. In both novels, Orwell points out dangers of a totalitarian regime. In 1984, Winston Smith is the protagonist who works for the Ministry of Truth, where the history is constantly being rewritten according to Big Brother's will, just like Stalin did. It is a propaganda machine. And we have thought police. It is a kind of police force that is searching for those with even the smallest negative thought against Big Brother's rule. People cannot get at truth or speak about it because gaslighters have eliminated all the competing sources of information. Everyone is paranoid, for they think they are always being watched or listened to, and anywhere around them can be an agent. Doubting Big Brother or questioning the party is a thought crime. In 1984, from the political and social perspective, the unspoken difference between facts and imposed beliefs is diagnostic of being gaslighted. And whoever might threaten Big Brother and the party's authority must be vaporized. They are called unperson. An unperson is someone whose entire history has been erased from the records. Here, I would like to present an extract from 1984, which depicts how truth is altered by the Ministry of Truth. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only in Winston's own consciousness. Which in any case must soon be annihilated. This is just an example of, actually, how they defile collective memory of a community, as I mentioned before. And this time we'll continue analyzing briefly stages of process of gaslighting. First one is disbelief. In likewise manner, just like I mentioned, during his interrogation and so-called rehabilitation process, O'Brien brings the same topic into discussion. I am taking trouble with you, Winston, he said, because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what's the matter with you. You have known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge they claim that is right. You're mentally deranged. You suffer from a defective memory. You're unable to remember real events, and you persuade yourself that you remember other events which never happened. In this extract, the seed of doubt is sown. And gaslighter is focused on manipulating the gaslightee into becoming dependent on himself. This is an attempt to remove the victim's demarcation of good and evil, right and wrong, past and present. O'Brien wants to break Winston in this stage. And again, I have some extracts. Fortunately, it is curable. You have never cured yourself of it because you did not choose to. Don't worry, Winston. You are in my keeping. For 7 years, I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect. Truth and memory. O'Brien asks him who is Oceania at war with. O'Brien does not accept his answer and insists that Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia and never with Eurasia. O'Brien imposes doublethink on Winston. In 1984, doublethink is a way of modulation of mind, basically containing both the original truth and the invented one. Then, in the process, discarding the original truth and making individual embrace the opposite one, the party imposed. Nevertheless, Winston does not remember anything like it, despite the physical and spiritual torture. He holds on to what he knows is correct. Second stage is defense. Winston has not broken yet. O'Brien continues. Gaslighting, following extract, represents the second stage. Not even identifiable ashes, dust. It does not exist. It never existed. Winston answers, but it did exist. It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it. You remember it. And O'Brien answers, I do not remember it. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. So second stage is actually a kind of struggling. And the last stage, depression, a mental collapse. The communication pattern discussed so far takes us to the latest stage where gaslighted individual suffers a mental collapse. Systematic gaslighting and isolation, along with torture, makes him give into depression. Following extract represents the latest stage. Then, suddenly, as he fixed the miserable rags around himself, a feeling of pity for his ruined body overcame him. Before he knew what he was doing, he had collapsed onto a small stool that stood beside the bed and burst into tears. But he could not stop himself. O'Brien laid a hand on his shoulder, almost kindly. I will share my concluding remarks. And 1984 was a novel of prophecy. Orwell's major concerns were the loss of historical objectivity and the formation of the language. People were ripped of the freedom of choice because of the totalitarian regimes. Textual manifestation of these thematic concerns created a suitable environment for interpersonal and political gaslighting cases. The Ministry of Truth's actions and the notion of doublethink represent a type of political gaslighting. Meanwhile, Winston's first-hand experience with O'Brien is more than just a brainwashing sequence and represents personal gaslighting. Consequently, gaslighting unconsciously employed by Orwell and serves him to achieve certain thematic perspectives in his famous satire. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Sinan. Our presentations are over, and if any of the participants have questions, we have time for questions or any kind of comments. If not, I guess we can close the session for today, and hopefully we'll see each other in the rest of the conference proceedings. Thank you all for your contributions and participation, and thank you to the organizers, and have a good evening.
Thank you.